Hello. In this video, we're going to work through building NPV functions, but not as functions per se. Instead, we're going to calculate NPVs in a sub, or a program that's triggered by something like a mouse click. For instance, this button here that says Run NPV Sub. So this is very similar to the NPV functions, which were actual user-defined functions we did in prior videos. Now we're just going to build the same thing in subs to see the differences between functions and subs. So now flipping over to VBA, we've got just a quick sketch of the program built out here, right? Or the shell rather. We have sub NPV, right? There's sub is the name of the program, right? It's the type of the program rather, and then NPV sub is what we're calling it. Notice there are no inputs to the function, to the sub rather, and that's just fine. In sub is going to be the final statement we have here. So this is the basic shell. Notice we also have our option explicit to make sure we declare all our variables. So let's start out by declaring a couple of those variables we're going to need. Now remember, inside the parentheses, we don't have anything here because it's not like a user-defined function. We don't have the user entering this function into Excel and then putting certain arguments or parameters within the parentheses. Instead, they're just going to click a button. So then we have to then get that information from them that we need to run our calculations. So for example, let's start out by initiating the first variables we're going to need, which are going to be things like the discount rate and also the number of periods of cash flows we're going to have. So we can start out with dim interest rate as a double, and let's dim time as an integer. So interest rate will be int rate will be the variable that we use to store our interest rate or the discount rate we're going to use, and then time will be the number of periods or the number of times of cash flows that we end up having. So now that we have those initiated, we need to get them from the user. And the way we're going to do that is set interest rate, int rate, equal to an input box. So the input box is going to be what the user sees, so they can type in that value and give it to us. So we can say, please enter, we'll say discount rate, will be the command they see. This will be inside a program that we call the NPV calculator. And finally, we need a default value, so let's just use 10%. Now I'll flip back over, we'll do our next variable as well, which is going to be our time. So time is also going to be an input box. I'm just going to come over here and copy the code to save a little bit of time. Please enter, and we'll say number of periods. And let's just do a default of, say, 5. So we can do 5 periods as our default there. So at this point, let's just go flip over to Excel, test that it's working. So I have already set up Excel to have this button tied to that sub. So let's go ahead and click our button, and right away we see our input boxes popping up. Right? So please enter the discount rate, 10%, great. Please enter the number of periods, 5, that'll be okay too. Now we haven't done anything yet, so the program's done executing. Right? We haven't done anything with those numbers yet to do calculations. So that'll be our next piece to add in. So we've initiated those variables and got them from the user. Now we need to think about how we could get those cash flows. So this is where we're going to have to set up some arrays. That way the user can give us values sequentially for cash flow 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. All right, so we're going to start off first. We're going to initiate a variable called CF for our cash flows. And we're going to put parentheses behind it. That's going to tell VBA that it's going to be an array. We're going to do that as a double. And now we have to give it the size. All right, so we've said it's going to be an array, this CF variable, but now we need to know how big it's going to be. So here we're going to use a new command called redim. And we're going to say redim CF 1 to time, where time is our variable. So that's going to tell it now that it needs to be from 1 all the way to 5. So it'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are going to be the 5 different kind of cubby holes or divisions within this variable called CF. We're going to do the same thing for another variable. We're going to call it store PV. Store PV is going to be a variable that we want to use to keep track of the present value of each cash flow. So we're just going to go ahead and get this initiated right now. We'll use it a little bit later in our code. Same 1 to time as we saw before. So now that we have our CF variable set up and we have the shell built, now we need to populate it with values from the user. So we can copy our input box. Let's move this down here. And we could say CF1 to refer to the first value in that array can be equal to please enter cash flow 1. And let's just assume that for a default, our cash flow values are 100. All right, so we can enter that for cash flow 1. We can do this exact same thing for cash flows 2, 3, 4, and 5. So let's build this 2, 3, 4, and 5. Please enter cash flow 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now let's go back to VBA, or Excel rather, to make sure everything's working. So we click our sub, 0.1, 5. We have our 5 different requests for cash flows. Everything looks okay so far. Now what I want to do is take a minute to clean up our code. So anytime you find yourself writing lines of code that are very similar, like I just did here with 5 different commands that look almost the same, there's a better way. So in this case, that better way is going to be with loops. So I'm going to dim I as an integer. This is going to be my looping variable. And I'm going to set up a loop that goes for I equals 1 to time. So it's going to loop over however many cash flows we need. And in each loop, it can get a different cash flow. So there I have my for loop set up. I'm going to go ahead and tab this in. And now what was 5 lines, I can actually reduce down to just 1. And the way I'm going to do that is by changing the index. Instead of cash flow 1, we have cash flow I. And now we're going to say, please enter cash flow I. Now, if we do that just like I've done it here, it's just going to say, please enter cash flow I every time. It'll literally be I and not the variable. So the adjustment we need to make is to take the I outside of the quotes and use ampersand to concatenate that together. Now we should see the exact same result with just much more compact code. So let's see that, make sure we're working. So we click Run PV again. We run through our options. We have cash flow 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If we want to get nitpicky, we can see that there's no space between flow and 5. So let's go ahead and add that when we go back into our code. All right, we can flip back over. Let's add that space so everything looks a little nicer and neater. All right, now we're to the point where we can actually start thinking about calculating the present values. So here we're going to need not only the individual present values, but to keep track of the cumulative present values over time. So I'm going to create a new variable called answer as double that'll keep track of that cumulative value. Now, because we've already set up a loop, right, previously, we can just copy that loop, and we're going to use that same loop with a little bit different code inside to calculate the present value of each cash flow. Remember, we set up store PV, so now we're going to calculate store PVI for each different cash flow as we go. So in this case, what we're going to do for each cash flow to discount it is we're going to take cash flow I and then divide by 1 plus the interest rate raised to the I periods. So the first cash flow will be discounted 1 period, the second cash flow 2 periods, etc. And we'll populate that store PV array with each of the present values of the cash flows. If we want to calculate the accumulated value then, we can also use answer. And we'll set answer equal to its previous value plus store PVI. That way each time through it increments and adds up the present value of the first cash flow, then the second cash flow, etc. Now we have an answer that seems to be working for us. Let's throw our message box out here just to report that answer to the user. And again, we're going to check back in Excel to make sure our code is working. By checking frequently, we avoid any debugging errors that might come in, which inevitably do as we write code. So let's flip back, run it again. So now we click through our defaults. Notice our defaults are really important to kind of make this testing procedure a little quicker. And now we had an answer box pop up. So there's our answer, $379.07. We'll say OK there. So it looks like we're getting a good answer so far. One thing I do like to clean up a little bit is instead of just showing answer with all those extra decimal places, let's just round that. So we're going to round answer to 2 decimal places. All right, so we've calculated our present value. We've output it to the user. Now we want to stop and ask, is there anything else that we want to add to this function, or rather to this program? As the last piece we might want to add here, we could think about giving each individual cash flow back to the user in message boxes as well. We calculated them, we might as well display them. So now we can build one last loop where we use a series of message boxes to display the present value of each cash flow. So here, let's change up this code. Again, I'm recycling code as much as I can. And I'm going to say message box, the present value of cash flow I is, and then we'll put store PVI as that last value that comes out. Let's see, and now we have to figure out what it didn't like. So we got to check our quotes. Oh, we forgot to do an ampersand at the very end there. All right, so we need ampersands between when we connect kind of strings or words that are in quotes that we have here and here with our variables, that is I and store PVI. So now we should get a series of message boxes that pop up and give us each of those values. So let's go back. As a final test, let's see what we get. We're going to click through our different values. Now we see there's one message box that gives us 379.08. It got nicely rounded. And now we get each of those different cash flows. Right? Those aren't really rounded very nicely, and we have a missing space between the one and the is. So we'll clean that a little bit up just to make this a little bit nicer for the user. So let's flip back, make those last couple changes. We need a space before is to make that look a little bit nicer. And let's also round this to 2 decimal places as well. All right. Let's just make this message box a little bit nicer. We'll say the NPV is. That way we have a little bit more of a descriptor of what's going on. All right, our final test now. Let's check. We have all our inputs. The NPV is 379.08. You could always put a $sign on there if you want to. And now we have the present value of each cash flow, nicely presented, nicely spaced. We're happy with our function. It gives the user what it